Hello, everybody. This is HTH. Yee. We're getting fancy now. House to home. See what I did there? Like we're only using acronyms right now, but one word we are going to talk about today, as Liz and Gina join me here in this KUM News Zoom room, as they always do on Tuesdays, is the E word, eviction. Oh boy. I know, ladies. I guess let me ask you, as realtors and as people who make their livelihood with facilitating and seeing transactions through that connect people with residential homes and commercial properties and everything like that. How often do you actually deal in evictions, or do you at all?
Well,
So
we get, go ahead, Gina.
I can share with you that we feel really lucky. In fact, I during COVID, I had an appraiser call me about what our eviction rate was at the time, and we were actually really blessed during the period of COVID. We did not have any tenants that we needed to evict. We had, out of all the management properties that we take care of, and I think we're almost at 200 properties, or maybe it's more than that. I only know the ones that I'm directly involved with, but out of all the properties that we manage, and we have a big management side of our company, we had about 5 tenants that were late on their payments but not delinquent, so that the owners were asking for evictions and they caught up. We worked with them and they caught up. So, and the appraiser, she just couldn't believe that we did not have any evictions. And we didn't. And that just boils down to, you know, the vetting process that we have when we put the tenants in to begin with. It's a very strict process. So, because we do spend a lot of time making sure that we're putting good tenants into good properties, that they basically, I mean, you start off with a good tenant and they're going to remain that way. And everybody needs help every now and then, and you just work with them accordingly. But
Oh,
yeah, we
okay.
were.
Well, fair enough. But now, Liz, I'd like your insight on the fact, or on the topic of, obviously that Gina was just talking about from the tenant's perspective. But if you are a landlord and you do have cause to evict the tenant for whatever reason and everything, I'm sure that that is a very set process, and there's a right probably and a wrong way to go about that, right? How do you actually do that by the book?
Well, when people call us and they're, for whatever reason, there's a problem and they want to do an eviction, of course, Gina and I, the first thing we do is problem solve. What is the issue? First, we try to, as she puts it, we try to help both sides to find out what the problem is before we jump to that process. We always want to avoid the eviction by, well, okay, what's the problem? How can we solve it? And if we solve it, then we don't go forward. But with the eviction, there's proper process where, again, if they come to us, we have to look at what is the contract state, what is allowable, what is not. And if for some reason they refer to the lease that they broke a certain section of the lease, again, we try to solve that by working with the tenant and the landlord. And then if that is not possible, then there's notice that would have to be given. But if it
And
gets
you
a
know
little,
about mediation from your work in nonprofit organizations, so
that's
you've had those
that's
conversations in multiple contexts, multiple times.
that's right. But again, and then depending on what the issue is, we always say, well, if this is what you choose to do, you may need to go get legal advice, because Gina and I are not attorneys, and a contract is a contract. And depending on what the violation or infraction was of the lease, we would say, hey, if you've contacted your attorney, but again, there is a process, a notice that has to be given that you are being evicted and these are the reasons. But then again, the tenant can come back and say, this is not valid. And then the tenant, more than likely, would have to go to their attorney to get their advice. And there are times when two attorneys go back and forth trying to settle. But I think Gina and I are of the belief, let's try to solve the problem before it gets more complicated and get to the eviction process. But in order to do that, it requires communication. Now, if both parties aren't talking, then that even makes it even more complicated. And at that point, we might just back up and say, hey, if you guys can't communicate or try to help solve the problem, then yep, maybe the only way would be to go through the attorneys.
Okay, now so Gina, if a say if a landlord does in fact issue an eviction notice to a tenant, but for some reason they go outside the bounds of what Liz was just talking about, right? Like they do something that the law doesn't allow, or they move too fast, or they were too heavy-handed, whatever the situation, right? They did something that was not legit. What course of action then does a tenant have? I mean, Liz was just saying, they can lawyer up and they can go that, but can they basically countersue, or could they do something and say, no, now you owe me 6 more months rent because you screwed up the process? Or
Well, so if you go online, you can Google the Landlord Tenant Act. Now, that was written specifically for residential leases.
Hmm.
I'm sure on the commercial side, you can use that as a guideline. I would imagine you could. But if you go online and you Google Landlord Tenant Act, it specifically says what a landlord and a tenant can do under the circumstances when, if you're in the position of, your landlord's giving you an eviction notice, and perhaps you feel like the landlord didn't give me enough time. Well, if you go to that document, it specifically tells you what the timeline should be. And the reason Liz was saying, communication is key. If we have somebody who causes, and sometimes we get involved, and it's not because it's a management unit, just people are calling to say, this is happening to me. And sometimes it's a landlord, sometimes it's a tenant. And, the tenant would call and say, this is happening to me. My landlord did ABC, and now they're giving me an eviction notice. The reason it's important to talk about this and have good communication between the landlord and the tenant, and this is our advice to you guys out there, landlord or tenants, if you're the tenant and you are being evicted because you did not pay the rent, and you can't afford to pay the rent because of the circumstances that you're in right now, ultimately you can wait. I mean, the landlord, so you go online and you look up the process, and they have to give you proper notice, and it's defined in the law. But ultimately, whether the landlord does it themselves or they get a lawyer, ultimately, if you're not paying the rent, you will be evicted from the property, and you're still going to owe that money because they could still come after you for that amount. So, when they come to us, our communication to them is, make this easy on yourself and make it easy on the landlord, and reduce your cost by moving out and finding a place that can accommodate you at a rental amount that you could afford. And if you can't afford anything right now, then there are services out there that can help you. And for landlords who reach out to us, we tell them, listen, the notices are dictated by law, so know the law. And you cannot just lock the place up because your tenant is not paying. Because we've had tenants call and say, our landlord just locked us out of the unit. Well, that's against the law. You cannot do that. And so we advise the landlords accordingly. That is not a course of action that is available to you, nor is it right. Even if it was available, is it right? Is it the right thing to do? It's not. So, make sure you're giving the proper notice and communicate with your tenants. I think you could work anything out if the communication is open.
okay, well,
Well,
Liz, yeah, final word is yours, because I was going to say both
the
of
other
you.
thing is,
Please,
if the tenant refuses to move out for whatever reason, and they have no place to go, and usually they'll say, well, I don't want to move. If that's the case, but then the landlord can go to an attorney, and then the attorney takes it to court. And when the attorney takes it to court, guaranteed there'll be a marshal at your door to remove you from the premises. So just for those who refuse to move out, there is a course of action that the landlord will take. We prefer they don't take that route, but if there's no other thing they can do, they can't forcibly go and force you to move out. But a court written order,
yeah.
at that point, it's by law. You don't
Okay,
have to wait.
okay. Absolute final question. Both of you have strenuously made the point that having good credit is obviously good for you, because that follows you around, as does bad credit, right? If you have been evicted, is this something that is on, maybe like some sort of some sort of permanent record? Like if you're in the military and you get dishonorably discharged, and does that hurt your ability to secure
If
residence forward?
if the landlord reports it, then yeah, that may show. But the thing to bear in mind, if you've been evicted and you're trying to get into a new rental property, they always ask, what was your previous landlord? And Gina and I, we always in our office, we're always checking who your landlord was, how were you as a tenant, did you pay on time, did you maintain the premises properly? And if you didn't, then that would be a no to try to get you into another unit, especially if you don't pay on time. That does affect. But landlords here, some of them may, report it to the credit bureau and it would appear. But again, and if they don't, then that might not appear on your credit. So, but that's something to bear in mind.
That's reason number 1,585,973 of why you should be a good tenant.
New landlords always check. They check background, they check previous landlords, they check employers sometimes to say they just want to make sure they get the proper references that tenant would be a good tenant.
Okay, well, I'm gonna come down to your offices in again and check you guys if you want to have coffee, because like I need some. It's the middle of the afternoon, and having this information from you was quite the motivational boost. But let's go get some coffee.
Fantastic.
On us.
All right, no, my tree. K1's got this. We'll take care of you guys. Okay, I'll see you guys in a few, and we will see you guys next week.